Guys, whatever's in there, it's big and it's moving fast.
We never had a chance.
You don't face your fears. Nope.
Twisters, 2024 Complete Film Analysis and Explanation. Twisters, 2024. These analyses and explanations begin with the understanding that the film functions not as a simple remake, but as a legacy sequel that honors the spirit of the 1996 original, while updating its concerns for a new era of climate anxiety and digital spectacle. The film opens with a profound meditation on trauma, establishing that this will not be the breezy disaster romp its predecessor occasionally was. Kate Carter, a meteorology student in Oklahoma, possesses a radical theory about disrupting tornadoes using superabsorbent polymer beads. Her enthusiasm is infectious, her team is tight-knit, and her boyfriend Jeb shares her passion, creating an almost idyllic portrait of scientific pursuit before the fall. The tragedy that follows is brutal in its swiftness. The tornado they are chasing intensifies without warning into an EF5, the highest and most devastating classification on the enhanced Fujita scale. In a sequence of genuine horror, Jeb, Addie, and Praveen are killed, their deaths rendered not as heroic sacrifices, but as sudden, meaningless erasure by a force that has no malice, only power. Kate's survival becomes its own kind of curse. The film flashes forward 5 years to find her in New York City, working a sterile NOAA desk job where tornadoes are reduced to data points and computer models. She is not healed. She has simply constructed a life where she never has to face what broke her. This is a nuanced depiction of post-traumatic avoidance that blockbuster cinema rarely attempts. The character of Javi re-enters her life as the serpent in this carefully maintained garden of safety. Now working for a company called Stormpar, he represents the seductive pull of unfinished business, the belief that technology can master what nature unleashed. He persuades Kate to return to Oklahoma for 1 week, and the film understands that this is simultaneously a betrayal of her psychological defenses and a necessary confrontation. Upon arrival, the storm-chasing landscape Kate once knew has been completely transformed by the digital age. This is no longer a niche community of scientists and enthusiasts. It has become a content ecosystem. The new terrain is loud, commercialized, and performative, and at its center stands Tyler Owens, a figure designed to provoke every skeptical instinct Kate possesses. Tyler Owens is introduced as a caricature of toxic influence culture. He calls himself the Tornado Wrangler, sells branded merchandise, performs dangerous stunts for views, and speaks in catchphrases that seem engineered for t-shirt sales. The film deliberately encourages the audience, through Kate's eyes, to dismiss him as everything wrong with the modern world's relationship to science and danger. Boone, Danny, Dexter, and Lily comprise Tyler's crew, and initially they scan as a collection of archetypes. The loud sidekick, the tech-savvy woman, the muscle, the drone operator. A British journalist named Ben rides with them to document the phenomenon, serving as an audience surrogate who asks the questions Kate is too contemptuous to voice. The first major set piece, involving the deployment of Javi's phased-array radar scanners, reestablishes Kate's competence while simultaneously exposing the lingering effects of her trauma. When a tornado forms, she freezes. Her body remembers what her mind has tried to bury, and the film does not treat this as a character flaw, but as a physiological reality of post-traumatic stress. The disaster sequence itself is technically magnificent. Director Lee Isaac Chung, cinematographer Dan Mindel, and the visual effects team collaborate to give the tornadoes weight, texture, and a kind of terrible personality. Debris is not just flying objects but lethal projectiles, and the sound design builds a roaring, churning presence that feels almost physical in the theater. The aftermath of the storm brings the characters to the devastated town of Crystal Springs, and it is here that the film executes its most satisfying narrative reversal. Kate arrives expecting to help with recovery, only to find Tyler's crew already there, doing the unglamorous work of distributing supplies and assisting residents. This revelation forces a complete recalibration of Tyler's character. His merchandise profits do not fund a lifestyle of empty celebrity. They constitute a direct pipeline from spectacle to solidarity. He has built a model where the performance of storm chasing generates resources that traditional aid organizations are too slow or too bureaucratic to deliver. The film complicates its own critique of influencer culture without entirely letting it off the hook. Simultaneously, the film introduces its true antagonist, though he barely occupies screen time. Marshall Riggs, the primary investor in Stormpar, is a real estate developer who purchases tornado-damaged land at rock-bottom prices from desperate homeowners. This is disaster capitalism in its most naked form, and Kate's dawning realization of Javi's complicity in this system creates the film's central moral crisis. The thematic architecture of the film emerges from this double revelation. On one side stands Tyler, whose performative recklessness masks genuine community commitment. On the other stands Javi, whose scientific legitimacy masks moral compromise. Kate must navigate between these two poles, and her journey becomes not just about facing tornadoes, but about discerning what authentic purpose looks like. The rodeo sequence in Stillwater represents a turning point in both the narrative and the film's tonal register. What begins as a cultural interlude and a moment of character bonding transforms with almost no warning into a survival horror scenario. The nighttime Yef that develops becomes the film's most terrifying antagonist because it cannot be seen, only heard. The depiction of the tornado's approach is masterful in its restraint. Chung treats the sequence almost like a home invasion film, with the characters trapped in an empty motel swimming pool as the roar builds and debris begins to fly overhead. The darkness makes the tornado omnipresent, a malevolent force that could be anywhere and everywhere at once. The swimming pool shelter scene functions as a crucible. Stripped of equipment, vehicles, and any pretense of control, the characters are reduced to their most elemental state, bodies huddling together against annihilation. The scene is terrifying not despite its simplicity, but because of it, and it forges a bond between Kate and Tyler that no dialogue could convincingly manufacture. Javi's betrayal of Kate in the aftermath of this near-death experience is the film's most psychologically acute moment. When confronted about Riggs, he does not apologize or explain, he attacks. He tells Kate that their friends' deaths were her fault, weaponizing her deepest wound as a defense against his own guilt. The cruelty is shocking precisely because it comes from someone who was there, who knows exactly where to strike. Kate's retreat to her mother's farm in Sepulpa is a return to the pre-traumatic self, the child who was fascinated by weather before it became a source of horror. The farm represents safety and origin, the place where curiosity was born untainted by consequence. Tyler's decision to follow her there, rather than letting her disappear, is the film's most romantic gesture. though it is framed entirely in terms of scientific and moral urgency rather than seduction. The old research notebooks that Tyler discovers in Kate's childhood bedroom serve as a tangible link to her uncorrupted scientific imagination. They contain the theory she was testing when her friends died, and Tyler's recognition of their value is a form of seeing her that no other character has managed. He understands that her avoidance of storm chasing is not cowardice, but a suppression of her most essential self. Tyler's proposition that they retry the experiment is pitched not as a shot at glory, but as an ethical obligation. The technology, if it works, could give people a fighting chance, a phrase the film invests with genuine weight. Kate's initial refusal is entirely understandable, and the film does not judge her for it. It simply waits for her to find her own reasons to say yes. "You don't face your fears, you ride them," becomes the film's thesis statement, a line that could have been trite but is earned by everything the narrative has established. The original Twister framed tornadoes as adversaries to be bested. This film reframes them as forces to be understood and redirected, a shift that reflects changing attitudes toward nature and human limitation. The first attempt at dissipating a tornado with the sodium polyacrylate beads fails. The film wisely does not make this easy. The failure is demoralizing, and it threatens to confirm Kate's deepest fear: that her theory was always a fantasy, that her friends died for nothing, that she has risked new lives for an illusion. The intervention of a now apologetic Javi with crucial radar data provides the missing piece. His redemption arc depends on this moment of genuine contribution, and the film ensures that it is not just emotional, but technically substantive. The data allows Kate to formulate a new hypothesis involving silver iodide, a real compound used in cloud seeding, grounding the fictional science in recognizable meteorological practice. The climax unfolds near El Reno, Oklahoma, a location chosen with deliberate and somber significance. The real El Reno tornado of 2013 was one of the most dangerous and unpredictable in recorded history, killing several veteran storm chasers. By setting its fictional apocalypse here, the film acknowledges the genuine mortal stakes of the pursuit it dramatizes. The tornado in the climax defies every expectation. It becomes rain-wrapped, invisible within a wall of precipitation, a scenario that real chasers describe as their worst nightmare. It strikes an oil refinery, transforming into a fire tornado, a mile-wide pillar of flame and debris that represents the film's most spectacular visual achievement and its most apocalyptic imagery. The evacuation sequence that follows shifts the film's focus from individual heroism to collective survival. Kate, Tyler, and their combined crews race to warn townspeople, but the storm shelters are full, and the infrastructure that was supposed to protect the community proves inadequate. The survivors are directed into a movie theater, an explicit homage to the original film's drive-in climax that also comments on the limits of public preparedness. Tyler's injury, pinned by a derailed streetcar, introduces genuine vulnerability to a character who has seemed almost superhuman. The film has spent its runtime deconstructing his performative invincibility, and this moment makes the deconstruction physical. He cannot charm or swagger his way out from under several tons of metal, and his dependence on others completes his humanization. Javi's arrival to help free Tyler is the culmination of his moral rehabilitation. Having finally quit Stormpar after witnessing Riggs' indifference to human life, he throws himself into the rescue effort not for redemption, but because it is simply the right thing to do. Anthony Ramos plays this beat without grandiosity, as a man doing what he should have been doing all along. With the theater's roof beginning to collapse and no basement to shelter in, Kate makes a decision that synthesizes everything the film has built. She takes Tyler's truck, drives directly into the tornado's core, and deploys both the silver iodide and the polymer beads. This is not suicidal recklessness. It is the informed, desperate courage of someone who has weighed the odds and accepted the cost. The tornado's dissipation is the film's moment of earned wish fulfillment. The science works. The truck, battered and nearly flipped, survives. Kate survives. The theater is heavily damaged, but people emerge alive. In a genre that often ends in catastrophe, this is a radical choice. A disaster film that allows its disaster to be defeated. The film's epilogue begins with Kate at an airport, waiting for a flight back to New York. The composition suggests a return to her old life, the safety of distance, the career that asked nothing of her heart. Tyler arrives, and their final conversation is tentative. Two people who have been through something transformative, but are uncertain whether transformation can survive ordinary life. The airport announcement that Kate's flight is delayed due to a tornado warning is the film's most elegant narrative joke. The universe has intervened, presenting her with a choice that is also not a choice. Her smile, her decision to grab her bag and leave with Tyler, is the completion of an arc that has been building since the opening tragedy. The closing montage reveals that Ben's article ultimately focused on Kate's work rather than Tyler's spectacle. This is a satisfying narrative correction, a recognition that the substance of scientific achievement matters more than the performance surrounding it. The new business that Kate, Tyler, Javi, and the Tornado Wranglers have started represents a synthesis: science with soul, research with community protection. Daisy Edgar-Jones's performance as Kate Carter anchors the film's emotional ambitions. She carries what critics have described as significant baggage, conveying trauma through physical hesitation and averted eyes rather than dialogue. Some have noted that she reads as younger than her character's age, but this may serve the material, as trauma can freeze emotional development at the moment of injury. Glen Powell's Tyler Owen succeeds by playing against the character's surface. Beneath the drawl and the catchphrases, Powell communicates a steady emotional intelligence, a man who has learned to perform recklessness precisely because his actual commitments are so serious. His chemistry with Edgar-Jones is described by critics as electric, but the film wisely keeps it as undercurrent rather than text until the final moments. Anthony Ramos is asked to navigate the film's most difficult moral terrain as Javi. He must be sympathetic enough that his betrayal wounds, compromised enough that his redemption satisfies, and ordinary enough that his presence never overshadows the leads. The performance is subtle rather than showy, which serves the character's function as a mirror for Kate's own unresolved guilt. The film's handling of Marshall Riggs as antagonist is notably restrained. He occupies perhaps 5 minutes of screen time, a deliberate choice that shifts the villainy from individual malice to systemic exploitation. The real antagonist is not a person but a logic, the logic of capital that sees disaster as opportunity, and Riggs is merely its most visible representative. Critics have noted that this thematic ambition is somewhat undercut by the subplot's underdevelopment. It remains unclear why Riggs funds Javi's research when their motives are fundamentally at odds, and the film never fully explores the tension between technological progress and its potential for weaponization. The critique is valid, though the subplot's presence still enriches the film's moral landscape. The visual effects represent a significant evolution from the 1996 original. Where the first film relied on practical effects, wind machines, and the physical presence of real debris, Twisters uses CGI to achieve scale and complexity that would have been impossible 3 decades ago. The trade-off is tangible: more spectacular imagery, less tangible grit. Which approach one prefers is largely a matter of aesthetic philosophy. The sound design deserves particular recognition for its role in the film's horror-adjacent sequences. The tornado's roar is not a constant. It builds, fades, modulates, and changes character depending on distance and intensity. In the nighttime rodeo sequence, sound does the work that visuals cannot, creating a monster out of wind and pressure differentials. Lee Isaac Chung's direction brings an unexpected sensitivity to the disaster genre. Coming from Minari, a delicate family drama, he treats the quiet moments with as much care as the spectacle. Kate's time on her mother's farm, Tyler reading her old notebooks, the shared silence after near death. These scenes breathe in ways that blockbuster filmmaking rarely permits. However, some critics argue that Chung is mismatched to the material, that his strengths in intimate drama create pacing issues between the action sequences. The film occasionally drags, and the dialogue, particularly in expository scenes, has been singled out as a weakness by multiple reviewers who describe it as cringy or functional at best. The dialogue problem is real, though its severity varies by scene. Lines like, "The tornadoes are coming after the people we love," ascribe intentionality to a natural phenomenon in ways that undermine the film's otherwise grounded tone. The screenplay by Mark L. Smith occasionally reaches for emotional shorthand when the actors and direction have already communicated the feeling. The comparison to the 1996 original is both inevitable and illuminating. The original Twister centered on a divorced couple's reconciliation, using the storm as metaphor for emotional turbulence. The sequel shifts focus to trauma recovery and community solidarity, reflecting broader cultural shifts from 1990s individualism toward 2020's mutual aid thinking. Structurally, the films are nearly identical, a fact that critics have both praised as respectful homage and criticized as creative timidity. The opening tragedy, the rival teams, the failed experiment, the climactic shelter sequence in a cinema-adjacent space, all follow the original's blueprint with updated details. Whether this constitutes homage or redundancy depends on one's attachment to the template. The theme of science versus spectacle runs through every creative decision in the film. Kate represents the purity of research, Tyler represents the necessity of communication, and the film ultimately argues that both are incomplete without the other. Science that remains obscure saves no lives. Spectacle without substance is empty entertainment. The film's treatment of social media and authenticity is notably ambivalent. Tyler's YouTube fame is presented as shallow and performative, yet it funds genuine good and builds community. The film does not resolve this tension, presenting it as a fact of contemporary life rather than a problem to be solved. The theme of post-traumatic growth is handled with more respect than most blockbusters manage. Kate's recovery is not linear. She freezes, she retreats, she lashes out, she regresses. Her final act of driving into the tornado is not a cure for trauma, but a transcendence of its paralytic effects, a reclamation of agency that does not pretend the wound has disappeared. The film's relationship to climate change is a subject of critical debate. The title's plural form alludes to the increasing frequency and intensity of tornado outbreaks, a phenomenon many scientists link to climate disruption. Yet no character ever says the words climate change, a silence that some view as political cowardice and others as a welcome restraint on didacticism. The masculinity of Tyler Owens is constructed as a deliberate subversion. He initially presents as a caricature of toxic masculinity, loud, reckless, self-aggrandizing, competitive. The film then systematically reveals that this is a performance for the YouTube algorithm, while his actual behavior is compassionate, deferential to Kate's expertise, and utterly without romantic pressure or possessiveness. This is a 2020s masculinity, confident but not domineering, capable of listening and following as well as leading. Tyler never once questions Kate's scientific authority, never positions himself as her savior, and the film's refusal to give them a conventional romantic climax respects her emotional journey more than a kiss in the rain ever could. The film's faith in science as salvation distinguishes it from many contemporary disaster narratives. In films where human hubris creates the monster, science is often the problem. Here, science is the only viable solution, and Kate's research, refined through failure and collaboration, ultimately dissipates the tornado. The film believes in human ingenuity while acknowledging its limits. The production budget of $155 million is visible in every frame of the disaster sequences. The tornadoes have heft, the debris physics are convincing, and the fire-tornado climax pushes visual spectacle to its current technological limit without becoming cartoonish. The investment in effects is matched by an investment in the Oklahoma locations, which cinematographer Dan Mindel shoots as lush and green rather than the stereotypical dusty plains. The film's box office performance, grossing over $372 million worldwide, demonstrates the enduring audience appetite for disaster spectacle when it is paired with even moderately competent character work. The 91% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, contrasted with the 75% critical rating, suggests that general viewers are more forgiving of the film's script weaknesses when the emotional and visual payoffs deliver. The critical reception reveals a fascinating split. Positive reviews praise the visual spectacle, cast chemistry, and subversion of expectations, with some calling it one of the best film-going experiences in recent memory. Negative reviews focus on dialogue, pacing, and comparison to the original, with some dismissing it as a pale shadow of its predecessor. The 6.5 out of 10 IMDb rating from nearly 200,000 users places the film in a respectable, but not exceptional range. This reflects the film's status as a well-executed piece of entertainment that does not transcend its genre, but operates within it with unusual care and occasional flashes of genuine inspiration. The rodeo tornado sequence has been singled out by multiple critics as the film's high point, a set piece that treats the storm almost like a horror villain. The suddenness of the tornado's development, the chaos of the crowd, and the specific terror of being unable to see the threat in darkness combine to create something genuinely frightening rather than merely spectacular. The film's epilogue, revealing that the characters have formed a new tornado research business combining science with community protection, is a quiet but significant political statement. It suggests that the solution to systemic problems is neither individual heroism nor corporate efficiency, but collective, community-oriented action that synthesizes diverse skills and perspectives. The casting of the supporting players, including the members of Tyler's crew, is handled with more care than the archetypes initially suggest. Boone's loyalty, Lily's competence, Dexter's technical expertise, and Danny's enthusiasm all receive small moments that gesture toward fuller characters, even if the script does not always give them the development they deserve. Ben, the British journalist, functions as a structural necessity, a character who can ask expository questions and receive answers that inform the audience. But the film gives him a small arc of his own, culminating in the revelation that his article ultimately centered on Kate rather than Tyler, a choice that validates the substance of her work over the spectacle of his. The film's depiction of Oklahoma is notably specific and affectionate. The locations, the culture, the rodeo, the small-town dynamics all feel observed rather than invented. This is not the generic Midwest of lesser disaster films, but a particular place with particular people. And the specificity grounds the fantasy in something that feels like reality. The original Twister featured a rival corporate storm-chasing team led by Cary Elwes's Jonas, a straightforward antagonist whose villainy was mostly professional jealousy and corporate slickness. Twisters replaces this with the more abstract threat of disaster capitalism, a choice that is more thematically ambitious, but arguably less dramatically satisfying due to the antagonist's reduced presence. The film's handling of death is notably restrained for a disaster movie. Beyond the opening tragedy, the body count is implied rather than shown. The focus remains on those who survive and how they survive, a choice that keeps the tone from becoming exploitative while still conveying the mortal stakes of the pursuit. The science of the film, while dramatized for narrative effect, is rooted in real meteorological concepts. Sodium polyacrylate is a genuine superabsorbent polymer. Silver iodide is actually used in cloud seeding. Phased array radar is a real technology being developed for weather monitoring. The film takes liberties, but its foundation is solid enough to maintain plausibility. The emotional climax of the film is not the dissipation of the tornado, but Kate's decision to stay. The airport scene, with its announcement of a tornado warning delaying her flight, is the narrative's final and most satisfying contrivance. The universe has given her permission to choose the life she was always meant to live, and her smile is the film's true happy ending. The theme of home runs quietly beneath the film's louder concerns. Kate leaves Oklahoma for New York, but Oklahoma never leaves her. Tyler is rooted in the communities he serves. Javi's betrayal is partly a betrayal of place, of the Oklahoma he and Kate shared with their fallen friends. The film argues that you cannot protect what you do not belong to. The film's relationship to its predecessor is ultimately one of respectful evolution rather than radical departure. It honors the original structure and spirit while updating its emotional and thematic content for an audience 3 decades removed from the first film's cultural moment. Whether this is enough depends on what one asks of legacy sequels. The pacing issues that critics have identified are real, but not fatal. The film occasionally loses momentum between set pieces, and some of the quieter scenes could benefit from tighter editing. But the lulls also serve a purpose, giving the audience space to breathe and the characters room to register as more than disaster response units. The visual language of the tornado sequences deserves close analysis. Chung and Mindel use a combination of wide shots that establish scale and close-ups that convey terror. The editing during action sequences is fast but legible, never descending into the incoherent chaos that plagues lesser blockbusters. You always understand the geography of danger. The film's color palette shifts meaningfully across its runtime. The early scenes in New York are cool and desaturated, reflecting Kate's emotional numbness. Oklahoma erupts in greens and golds, the vibrancy of the landscape contrasting with the violence of the storms that roll across it. The fire tornado climax introduces apocalyptic orange and red, a visual escalation that mirrors the narrative stakes. The score by Benjamin Wallfish incorporates and reworks themes from the original film's score by Mark Mancina, creating a sonic bridge between the two works. The music during action sequences is propulsive without being overwhelming, and the quieter character moments are given room to breathe without being drowned in sentiment. The film's treatment of technology is nuanced and ambivalent. Javi's phased array radar represents the promise of data to predict and protect. Tyler's YouTube channel represents the capacity of media to connect and mobilize. But both technologies are also shown to be co-optable, subject to the profit motives and attention economics that distort their potential. The final image of Kate leaving the airport with Tyler, abandoning her flight, abandoning her old life, is a romantic conclusion that the film has earned through restraint. They do not kiss. They do not confess love. They simply walk toward the next storm together, and that shared direction is more meaningful than any declaration could be. The film's ultimate argument is that trauma does not disqualify you from purpose. Kate's wound never fully heals, but it becomes integrated into a larger identity that includes courage, competence, and connection. The film offers not catharsis but continuity, the suggestion that life after devastation is possible and can be meaningful. The disaster capitalism subplot, underdeveloped though it is, gains retrospective resonance in an era of increasing climate-related disasters. The question of who profits from destruction and who is left to rebuild is not academic. It is the practical reality of communities from Oklahoma to Louisiana to California. The film gestures toward this conversation without fully engaging it. The chemistry between Edgar Jones and Powell succeeds because it is built on mutual respect rather than physical attraction. They are drawn together by shared values and complementary skills. And the film understands that this is a more durable foundation for partnership than the charged banter that characterizes many screen romances. The supporting cast of storm chasers, including both Tyler's crew and the remnants of Kate's original team, creates a sense of community that enriches the film's emotional landscape. These are people who have chosen a dangerous, uncertain life because it matters, and their camaraderie feels earned rather than scripted. The film's legacy as a sequel will likely be determined by whether it stands on its own for viewers who never saw the original. The critical and commercial evidence suggests it largely does, even as the echoes and homages reward those who carry the 1996 film in their memory. The ending's emphasis on a new business, a collaborative enterprise, rather than individual triumph, is a quiet but significant political statement. In a genre that often celebrates the lone hero, Twisters insists that lasting change requires collective effort, diverse expertise, and a commitment to community that outlasts any single storm season. The film's 75% critical approval rating places it in the upper tier of contemporary blockbusters, which often struggle to satisfy a critical establishment skeptical of spectacle-driven filmmaking. That it achieved this while delivering the visual goods expected of a summer disaster movie is an achievement worth acknowledging. The IMDb user score of 6.5 out of 10 from such a large sample size suggests a film that meets expectations without exceeding them, a solid entertainment that does not pretend to be more than it is. For some viewers, this will be enough. For others, the film's unwillingness to push further into its own thematic territory will register as a missed opportunity. The final analysis must acknowledge that Twisters operates within significant constraints, the expectations of a legacy sequel, the demands of summer blockbuster spectacle, the four-quadrant audience calculus that shapes modern studio filmmaking. That it manages, within these constraints, to tell a coherent story about trauma, community, and the redirection of destructive forces is a quiet triumph of craft and intention. The film does not reinvent the disaster genre. It does not transcend its origins or revolutionize its form. What it does, with considerable skill and surprising tenderness, is remind us that even the most formulaic structures can house genuine feeling, that spectacle and substance are not opposed, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is drive toward the thing that almost destroyed you, not to defeat it, but to understand it enough to save others. The sodium polyacrylate beads that Kate initially theorizes would disrupt a tornado's internal dynamics represent a genuine scientific concept translated into narrative function. Superabsorbent polymers capable of absorbing hundreds of times their weight in water, creating a gel-like substance that, in theory, could interfere with the moisture and pressure differentials that sustain a tornado's rotation, though the film wisely acknowledges through the failure of the first attempt that theoretical elegance does not guarantee practical efficacy when confronting forces as chaotic and powerful as an EF5 vortex. The shift in Kate's meteorological approach from pure disruption to a hybrid methodology incorporating silver iodide, a compound with documented use in cloud seeding operations dating back to the mid-20th century, reflects the film's underlying argument that scientific progress requires adaptability rather than rigid adherence to initial hypotheses. And the sequence where she reformulates her theory using Javi's phased array radar data demonstrates the iterative nature of genuine research. where failure is not a verdict, but a data point leading toward refinement. The phased array radar technology that Javi's company develops represents a significant advancement over the Dorothy sensor pods of the original film, moving from scattered ground-level measurements to a comprehensive three-dimensional scanning capability that can map the internal structure of a tornado in real time, providing the kind of high-resolution data that meteorologists have long sought as the holy grail of severe weather research, and the film treats this technology with appropriate reverence even as it critiques the corporate structures that fund its development. The visual representation of the radar data, rendered as luminous three-dimensional models of tornado interiors on screens throughout the film, serves both an expository function and an aesthetic one, translating the invisible dynamics of wind shear, pressure gradients, and debris distribution into comprehensible imagery that allows the audience to grasp what the characters are pursuing, while simultaneously creating a visual parallel between the digital models and the physical reality that underscores the gap between understanding and experience. The film's opening sequence at the university research facility establishes the camaraderie of Kate's original team through small, specific details rather than exposition-heavy dialogue. The way Praveen adjusts equipment with meticulous precision, how Addie's enthusiasm manifests in rapid-fire observations, the comfortable physical proximity between Kate and Jeb that communicates their relationship without needing to announce it, all building a sense of lived-in community that makes it sudden destruction viscerally impactful rather than merely narratively convenient. The transition from the university setting to the Oklahoma plains represents a movement from controlled scientific environments to the unpredictable theater of real-world research, where theoretical models encounter the messy complexity of actual weather systems, and the film's cinematography shifts accordingly from the warm, contained lighting of academic spaces to the vast, exposed horizons of Tornado Alley, a visual language that underscores the vulnerability of human ambition when confronted with the scale of atmospheric phenomena. The 5-year time jump that follows the tragedy is handled with admirable restraint, the film refusing to linger on the immediate aftermath of the deaths or to sentimentalize the grieving process, instead showing us Kate in her new life and allowing the audience to infer the emotional journey that led her there from the details of her current circumstances, the bare walls of her New York apartment, the fluorescent sterility of her NOAA office, the way she flinches slightly when a colleague mentions severe weather. The NOAA office where Kate works in New York is depicted as a place of orderly, abstracted science, where storms are studied at a remove through satellite imagery and computer models, a safe distance from the lived experience of wind and debris and terror, and the film subtly critiques this institutional approach not as worthless but as incomplete, lacking the embodied knowledge that only comes from being present at the point of contact between human understanding and natural force. Javi's reappearance in Kate's life is staged with the careful tension of a recovering addict being offered their substance of choice, his enthusiasm for Storm PR's technology masking the moral compromises he has made, and Daisy Edgar Jones plays Kate's initial refusal with a complex mixture of genuine disinterest and barely suppressed longing, the part of her that still dreams of tornadoes warring with the part that has constructed an entire life around never facing them again. The decision to set much of the film's second act within the ecosystem of storm-chasing content creators reflects a canny understanding of how the landscape of this subculture has transformed in the age of YouTube, TikTok, and monetized attention, where the line between genuine enthusiasm and performative spectacle has become increasingly difficult to discern. And the film navigates this terrain without easy condemnation or celebration, presenting it as a complex reality that must be engaged, rather than dismissed. Tyler's crew functions as a kind of found family, a collection of individuals whose skills and personalities complement each other in ways that transcend their initial archetypal presentations. Boone's comic relief masking genuine loyalty and courage, Lily's technical expertise revealed gradually through action rather than declaration, Dexter's physical strength deployed in service of others, Danny's enthusiasm proving infectious rather than irritating, and the film's willingness to give each of them moments of genuine contribution elevates them above the disposable sidekicks of lesser blockbusters. The British journalist Ben, played with understated dry humor, serves a more sophisticated narrative function than the typical audience surrogate character, his outsider perspective allowing the film to comment on the strangeness of American storm-chasing culture without becoming didactic, and his ultimate decision to focus his article on Kate's scientific work rather than Tyler's spectacle represents a quiet victory for substance over style that the film earns through his gradual understanding of what actually matters in this world. The motel swimming pool shelter sequence deserves extended analysis as the film's most effective fusion of character and spectacle. The confined space forcing physical proximity between Kate and Tyler that accelerates their emotional connection without the need for romantic dialogue. The darkness rendering the approaching tornado as pure sound and vibration. The debris that begins to fall into the pool creating a rain of lethal objects that transforms a mundane location into a space of primal terror. The sound design in the swimming pool sequence shifts from the distant roar of the approaching tornado to an almost subsonic rumble that the audience feels as much as hears. The individual impacts of debris creating percussive accents against the continuous wall of noise, and the characters' breathing and whispered reassurances providing a human counterpoint to the overwhelming acoustic assault of the storm. A careful orchestration of sound that demonstrates how audio can be as important as visuals in creating cinematic terror. The aftermath of the nighttime tornado sequence, with the characters emerging into a transformed landscape of destruction, is shot with a desaturated palette that emphasizes the gray of debris and the absence of the vibrant colors that characterized earlier scenes. A visual representation of the emotional weight that survival carries, and the silence that follows the storm is more powerful than any score could be, allowing the audience to sit with the reality of what has just occurred. Kate's confrontation with Javi about Riggs occurs in this devastated landscape, and the setting is thematically significant, the wreckage of a community providing the backdrop for the revelation of Javi's complicity in a system that profits from such wreckage. The visual evidence of what disaster capitalism feeds on surrounding them as Kate demands accountability from the friend who has become complicit in the exploitation of suffering. Javi's defensive cruelty in this scene, his weaponization of Kate's trauma as a shield against his own guilt, is psychologically acute writing that understands how survivors of shared tragedy can become each other's most effective torturers, knowing exactly where the wounds are because they were present when they were inflicted. And Anthony Ramos plays the moment not as villainy, but as the desperate lashing out of someone who cannot bear to see himself clearly. The journey to Kate's mother's farm is a pilgrimage to origins, the geographical movement from the chaos of the chase to the stillness of childhood creating space for introspection, and the farm itself is rendered with tactile specificity. The worn wood of the porch, the fields stretching to the horizon, the sky that dominates every view, a place where the weather is not an abstraction, but a constant presence that shapes daily existence. Kathy Carter, Kate's mother, appears only briefly, but her presence is substantial. A woman who has watched her daughter retreat from the world and has waited patiently for her return. Her few lines of dialogue conveying years of unspoken worry and love, and her immediate acceptance of Tyler, seeing through his performance to the substance beneath, demonstrates a maternal perception that cuts through the defenses both younger characters have constructed. The old research notebooks that Tyler discovers represent Kate before the wound, the young scientist whose curiosity was pure and untainted by consequence. The handwriting and diagrams revealing a mind that found joy in understanding rather than fear in proximity, and Tyler's recognition of their value is the moment Kate begins to see him clearly, not as the caricature she constructed, but as someone who genuinely understands what she has lost. The decision to have Kate's first attempt at dissipating a tornado fail is structurally necessary and thematically rich, preventing the narrative from becoming a simple story of redemption through repetition, forcing Kate to confront the possibility that her friends died for an idea that does not work, and creating the conditions for genuine collaboration with Javi when he arrives with the radar data that provides the missing variable. The silver iodide deployment represents a synthesis of Kate's original theory with new information, a model of scientific thinking that refuses to abandon core insights while remaining open to modification, and the film's depiction of this intellectual process, compressed though it is for cinematic purposes, respects the reality of research as iterative and collaborative rather than solitary and instantaneous. The El Reno location carries historical weight that the film does not explicitly acknowledge, but that informs the sequence's tension for anyone familiar with storm-chasing history. The 2013 tornado that killed Tim Samras, his son Paul, and Carl Jung having occurred in this same area. And the decision to set the film's climax here is a gesture of respect toward the real dangers of this pursuit that prevents the fantasy from feeling entirely disconnected from reality. The oil refinery strike that transforms the tornado into a fire vortex is the film's most visually audacious choice, the combination of extreme wind and ignited petroleum creating imagery that pushes toward the apocalyptic, and the visual effects team renders the fire tornado with a hellish beauty that makes it simultaneously terrifying and mesmerizing. A pillar of flame rotating against the Oklahoma sky like something from Revelation. The evacuation sequence that follows is grounded in the practical logistics of disaster response. The storm shelters filled to capacity, the infrastructure designed for normal emergencies proving inadequate for catastrophe, and the film's attention to these details, the panicked families, the overwhelmed officials, the impossible calculus of who gets shelter and who does not, adds a layer of realism to the escalating spectacle. The movie theater shelter is an explicit homage to the original film's drive-in climax, but it is also a commentary on the limits of nostalgia. The indoor theater providing less protection than the open space of a drive-in might have, the roof that begins to collapse representing the failure of structures we assume will hold, and the survivors huddled together as the ceiling gives way create an image of collective vulnerability that transcends homage. Tyler's injury beneath the derailed streetcar introduces physical limitation to a character defined by physical capability. The man who drives into tornadoes for a living suddenly immobilized by mundane metal, and his dependence on Javi for rescue completes the reconciliation between the two men, the former rivals united by circumstance and necessity in a way that conversation alone could never achieve. Javi's abandonment of Stormpar is not a dramatic renunciation but a quiet departure. The decision made before the climax and demonstrated through action rather than declaration, and this restraint is characteristic of the film's approach to character development, trusting the audience to infer internal transformation from external behavior without requiring every emotional beat to be articulated. Kate's drive into the tornado core is the film's most overtly symbolic sequence. The truck is vehicle for both literal and metaphorical journey, the increasing violence of the wind representing the chaos she has avoided for 5 years, the moment of calm at the center providing the clarity she needs to deploy the solution. And her survival is not guaranteed by the narrative logic, but earned through the courage it takes to stop running. The dissipation of the YF-5 is rendered not as explosion but as unwinding, the tornado losing coherence, its rotation slowing, the debris falling, and this visual choice emphasizes the scientific mechanism over the spectacular. The film remaining committed to its premise that understanding and intervention are possible even at extreme scales, a fundamentally optimistic assertion about human capability. The airport epilogue begins with visual echoes of the film's opening New York scenes, the sterile architecture, the fluorescent lighting, the anonymity of transit spaces, suggesting the possibility that Kate might return to her old life unchanged. And the tension of the scene derives from the audience's uncertainty about whether her transformation will hold when removed from the immediate pressure of crisis. The announcement of the tornado warning that delays Kate's flight is the film's final and most satisfying use of contrivance, the weather itself intervening to prevent her retreat, and the smile that spreads across her face is the first completely unguarded expression Daisy Edgar Jones has been allowed to play. The release of 5 years of suppression in a single moment of recognition that she is exactly where she belongs. The closing montage of the new business, the collaborative enterprise combining Kate's science, Tyler's community connections, Javi's technical expertise, and the crew's diverse skills, presents an image of post-disaster organization that is quietly radical, suggesting that the appropriate response to systemic failure is not individual heroism or corporate efficiency, but collective, community-grounded action. Ben's article focusing on Kate is the film's final comment on the relationship between substance and spectacle. The journalist who was initially drawn to Tyler's flamboyance ultimately recognizing that the real story is the quiet scientist who risked everything to give people a fighting chance, and this narrative correction is satisfying without being preachy. The film trusting the audience to draw its own conclusions about what deserves attention. The film's relationship to the 1996 original can be understood through the lens of what cultural critics call the legacy sequel phenomenon. Works that revisit established properties not to continue stories, but to update them for changed cultural circumstances. And Twisters succeeds in this mode by identifying what made the original resonant. Not the specific plot points or characters, but the sense of awe at natural power and the drama of human response to forces beyond control. The shift from the original's focus on a divorced couple's reconciliation to the sequel's focus on a trauma survivor's recovery reflects broader cultural changes in how we understand relationships and healing. The 1990s emphasis on romantic partnership as the site of emotional resolution giving way to a 2020s emphasis on individual psychological integration as the foundation for any healthy connection. The film's treatment of masculinity through Tyler Owens deserves recognition as one of the more thoughtful engagements with the subject in recent blockbuster cinema. The character functioning as a case study in how traditional masculine traits like confidence and risk-taking can be redirected toward prosocial ends when separated from the dominance and emotional repression that often accompany them. The absence of a conventional romantic resolution between Kate and Tyler is perhaps the film's most surprising and mature choice. The airport scene ending not with a kiss, but with a shared decision to chase a storm. Their partnership established through aligned purpose rather than physical consummation. And this restraint suggests a confidence in the audience's ability to recognize connection without requiring its explicit confirmation. The disaster capitalism subplot, however underdeveloped, introduces a political dimension to the disaster genre that most entries in the form avoid. The recognition that natural disasters do not affect communities equally, and that the aftermath of destruction creates opportunities for exploitation that compound the initial tragedy. And while the film does not fully explore this territory, its willingness to gesture toward it distinguishes it from more apolitical blockbusters. The film's visual effects represent the current state of the art in digital disaster simulation. The tornadoes achieving a level of detail and behavioral plausibility that would have been impossible even a decade ago. But the film also understands that effects alone cannot create tension, deploying them in service of character and situation rather than allowing them to become the primary focus of attention. The sound design throughout the film operates as an independent storytelling channel. The varying qualities of wind noise, the specific timbre of different debris impacts, the way silence is used in the aftermath of destruction, all contributing to an acoustic environment that grounds the visual spectacle in sensory reality and prevents it from floating into weightless digital abstraction. The score by Benjamin Wallfisch walks a careful line between homage and originality, incorporating enough of Mark Mancina's themes from the 1996 film to establish continuity while developing new musical material for the new characters and situations. And the result is a soundtrack that feels connected to its predecessor without being trapped by it. The cinematography by Dan Mindel captures Oklahoma as a character in its own right, the vast skies that dominate the frame, the particular quality of light before a storm, the way the landscape seems to stretch endlessly in every direction, creating a sense of exposure and vulnerability that no urban setting could provide, the human figures dwarfed by the scale of their environment. The editing during action sequences balances clarity with chaos, the audience never losing spatial orientation, even as debris flies and characters scramble. And this legibility is crucial to the film's effectiveness, as the terror of the tornado sequences depends on understanding exactly how close the danger is and how limited the options for escape have become. The film's pacing, criticized by some reviewers as uneven, actually follows a rhythm that mirrors the experience of storm chasing itself. Long periods of anticipation and travel punctuated by sudden, intense bursts of action, and this structural choice, whether intentional or not, creates an experiential authenticity that a more conventionally paced film might sacrifice for momentum. The dialogue weaknesses that critics have identified are real but contextual, the occasional clunky line standing out precisely because the film's overall verbal register is more naturalistic than typical blockbuster fare. And the performances often rescue weak writing through delivery that finds emotional truth beneath functional exposition. The age rating recommendation of 14 and above reflects the film's approach to intensity, which derives more from sustained tension and psychological distress than from graphic violence or gore. The PG-13 rating achieved through implication rather than explication. And this restraint makes the film accessible to younger viewers, while still providing genuine stakes for adults. The film's educational potential is significant but underexploited. The scientific concepts presented accurately enough to spark curiosity without being developed to the point of pedagogy. And one can imagine a version of this material that more explicitly engaged with the meteorology behind the spectacle, though such a version might have struggled to maintain the pacing that summer audiences expect. The global box office performance, with international receipts nearly matching domestic returns, demonstrates the universal appeal of disaster spectacle when it is grounded in recognizable human emotion. The specific American context of Tornado Alley translating across cultural boundaries because the underlying themes of loss, courage, and community are not culturally bounded. The critical divide between professional reviewers and general audiences, the 75% critical score versus the 91% audience rating, reflects a genuine disagreement about what constitutes quality in blockbuster filmmaking, with critics privileging originality and formal innovation, while audiences reward emotional engagement and spectacle delivery. And the film's position astride this divide suggests it is doing something right even if not everything perfectly. The film's legacy will likely be determined by whether it serves as a gateway to the disaster genre for viewers too young to have experienced the 1996 original, its success in creating new fans for this mode of storytelling mattering more than its fidelity to its predecessor's specific choices, and the early evidence suggests it has achieved this intergenerational transmission of enthusiasm. The final image of Kate walking away from the airport with Tyler, her bag slung over her shoulder, the storm warning still active, the future uncertain but chosen rather than imposed, encapsulates the film's argument that the appropriate response to trauma is not elimination of risk, but re-engagement with the world on terms that acknowledge both vulnerability and capability. A message that resonates beyond the specific context of tornado chasing to speak to the universal human experience of learning to live after loss. The film's treatment of nature as neither benevolent nor malevolent, but simply powerful, a force that can be understood and sometimes influenced but never controlled, represents a philosophical position that steers between the techno-optimism of some disaster narratives and the eco-pessimism of others, suggesting that humility and ingenuity are not opposed but complementary attitudes toward a world that exceeds human scale. The ensemble nature of the film's resolution, with survival and success distributed across the entire cast rather than concentrated in a single hero, reflects a democratic sensibility that distinguishes Twisters from more individualistic blockbusters. The argument being that no one person, however brilliant or brave, can solve problems that require diverse skills, local knowledge, and collective commitment. The film's silence on climate change, noted by multiple critics as a missed opportunity or a political choice, can be read alternatively as a commitment to showing rather than telling, the increased frequency and intensity of tornadoes depicted on screen functioning as implicit evidence of a changing climate without requiring characters to articulate what the audience can observe. Though reasonable people will disagree about whether this approach constitutes restraint or evasion. The technology that the film celebrates is notably low in carbon footprint compared to the infrastructure of fossil fuel extraction. The phased array radar and chemical dissipation representing scientific ingenuity applied to adaptation rather than exploitation, and this distinction, while subtle, aligns the film with an environmental sensibility that seeks to work within natural systems rather than dominate them. The emotional register of the film's final act is notably restrained for a summer blockbuster. The triumph of the tornado's dissipation tempered by the destruction that has already occurred. The survivors emerging from the theater not into victory, but into a damaged world that will require years of rebuilding. And this tonal complexity is rare in a genre that typically resolves its conflicts with unambiguous celebration. The film's commitment to showing the aftermath of disaster, the ongoing work of recovery, the emotional toll on survivors, distinguishes it from disaster movies that treat destruction as spectacle without consequence, and the closing montage's emphasis on the new business as a vehicle for ongoing community support suggests that the story does not end when the tornado dissipates. The casting of Daisy Edgar Jones, a British actor, as an Oklahoma native raised eyebrows during production but proves successful in execution. Her slight remove from the specific cultural context actually serving the character's own sense of displacement after years in New York. And her American accent work is seamless enough to prevent distraction while allowing the emotional transparency that is her greatest strength as a performer. Glen Powell's Oklahoma roots, by contrast, inform his performance at a cellular level, the rhythms of his speech, his physical ease in the landscape, his understanding of the cultural codes of the region, all contributing to a characterization that feels inhabited rather than imitated. And this authenticity grounds the more theatrical aspects of Tyler's persona in a recognizable reality. The chemistry between the two leads has been widely praised and appropriately so, but what makes it work is less the romantic tension than the intellectual respect they develop for each other's expertise. The film understanding that attraction between adults is often rooted in recognition of competence, in seeing someone do something difficult well, rather than in the meet-cute dynamics that dominate less sophisticated romances. The film's treatment of grief is unusually mature for its genre, acknowledging that loss does not diminish over time so much as it becomes integrated into identity, that the dead remain present as absence, and that healing is not about forgetting, but about learning to carry the weight without being crushed by it. A perspective that gives Kate's journey a gravity that transcends the disaster movie framework. The marketing campaign that positioned the film as a summer thrill ride did not fully communicate the emotional substance that distinguishes it from more disposable entertainments. And this mismatch between promotion and product may explain some of the critical resistance. Reviewers arriving expecting empty spectacle and finding something more textured, or conversely, audiences arriving for spectacle and being surprised by depth. The film's rewatch value is enhanced by the Tyler subversion. The early scenes playing differently once the audience knows the truth of his character, his apparent arrogance revealed as performance, his commercialism as fundraising, his catchphrases as branding for a cause. And this layering rewards the attentive viewer in ways that more straightforward characterizations would not. The supporting performances from the actors playing Tyler's crew members, while not given extensive screen time, create the sense of a larger world beyond the frame. These characters having histories and relationships that the film gestures toward without fully exploring. And this restraint is preferable to the alternative of token backstories that reduce complex individuals to single explanatory traumas. The film's use of Oklahoma locations, including practical shooting in tornado-prone regions, lends an authenticity to the proceedings that soundstage work could not replicate. The quality of light, the texture of the landscape, the specific architecture of small-town main streets, all contributing to a sense of place that grounds the fantastical elements in recognizable reality. The decision to make the antagonist a system rather than a person, disaster capitalism rather than a rival storm chaser, is thematically ambitious but dramatically risky, as systems do not provide the personal confrontation that narrative often requires, and the film mitigates this risk by giving Javi the emotional weight of the conflict, making him the face of the system, even as he is also its victim. The final verdict on Twisters must acknowledge its achievements in character work, visual spectacle, and thematic ambition, while also recognizing its limitations in dialogue, pacing, and the incomplete development of its political subtext. A film that reaches for more than it fully grasps, but that grasps enough to provide a satisfying and occasionally moving experience. The film stands as evidence that the blockbuster form, often dismissed as inherently compromised by commercial pressures, remains capable of housing genuine human observation and emotional truth, that spectacle and substance are not enemies but potential allies, and that the summer movie season can deliver not just distraction, but the particular satisfaction of seeing human courage and intelligence tested against forces that remind us of our scale and our resilience. The meteorological jargon that peppers the dialogue, terms like inflow notch, rear flank downdraft, mesocyclone, and velocity couplet, is deployed with enough contextual clarity that it enhances verisimilitude without alienating viewers unfamiliar with severe weather terminology, and this linguistic authenticity, vetted by the storm chaser consultants who advised the production, creates an immersive soundscape of professional competence that makes the characters feel like real practitioners rather than actors playing scientists. The relationship between Kate's trauma and her scientific imagination is psychologically intricate, her avoidance of storms paralleling a constriction of her intellectual creativity, the vibrant hypothesizing of her youth replaced by the rote analysis of a bureaucratic position, and her return to Oklahoma becomes not just a geographic journey but a cognitive reawakening. The reopened notebooks symbolizing the reopening of a mind that had closed itself off from its own capabilities. The film's depiction of female scientific expertise avoids the common trap of having Kate prove herself through masculine-coded aggression or coldness, instead allowing her competence to manifest through careful observation, methodical preparation, and collaborative leadership, a portrayal of feminine authority that does not require the abandonment of emotional intelligence or interpersonal warmth. The economic realities of storm chasing in the 21st century receive more attention than is typical for the genre, with the film acknowledging the financial pressures that drive researchers toward corporate funding, the monetization strategies that sustain independent chasers, and the uncomfortable truth that even the purest scientific motives must eventually contend with the question of who pays for the equipment and the fuel and the time. The rodeo sequence before the nighttime tornado serves multiple narrative functions simultaneously, establishing the cultural context of rural Oklahoma, providing a setting for character bonding that feels organic rather than forced, demonstrating Tyler's genuine integration into the community he professes to serve, and building a false sense of security that the sudden tornado warning will shatter with maximum dramatic impact. The depiction of the crowd's panic when the tornado warning sounds at the rodeo is choreographed with documentary realism. The initial confusion giving way to surging movement, the separation of families, the shouted instructions that go unheard or unheeded. And this chaos serves as a reminder that tornadoes do not only threaten the prepared storm chasers, but the ordinary people whose lives intersect with the storm's path without warning. The film's treatment of the American landscape as simultaneously beautiful and hostile draws on a long tradition of environmental cinema, the wide shots of golden fields and dramatic cloud formations evoking the sublime, the sense of awe mixed with terror that natural grandeur inspires, and the tornadoes themselves become the ultimate expression of this duality, mesmerizing and murderous in equal measure. The economic stratification revealed by the tornado's path through different communities, the well-built storm shelters of the affluent versus the vulnerable mobile homes of the working class, introduces an environmental justice dimension that the film touches upon without fully developing, a recognition that natural disasters amplify existing inequalities, even as the film remains primarily focused on its character-driven narrative. The mentorship dynamic that develops between Kate and Lily, the drone operator in Tyler's crew, offers a glimpse of intergenerational scientific community that the film might have explored further. The younger woman looking to Kate as a model of female expertise in a male-dominated field, and their brief interactions suggest a lineage of women scientists that extends beyond the frame. The film's sound mix during the fire-tornado sequence layers multiple audio elements: the roar of wind, the crackle of flame, the percussive explosions of ignited fuel tanks, the emergency sirens, the shouted communications between characters, into a cacophony that threatens to overwhelm the audience's sensory processing, creating a visceral analog for the characters' experience of being assaulted by stimuli beyond their capacity to manage. The theological undertones that surface occasionally in the film, characters praying, the church steeple that survives a direct hit, the language of miracles and deliverance, acknowledge the role that faith plays in communities that live under constant threat from natural forces, without either endorsing or mocking the religious response to disaster, a neutrality that respects the complexity of belief in the face of incomprehensible destruction. The film's treatment of the body in extremis, the physical toll of running, ducking, climbing, being thrown, being cut by debris, grounds the spectacle in corporeal reality, the characters accumulating bruises and exhaustion rather than emerging from each encounter with the tornadoes magically unscathed, and this attention to physical consequence makes the danger feel genuine rather than gamified. The truck that Kate drives into the tornado's core becomes a character in its own right, Tyler's modified vehicle equipped with anchoring systems and reinforced bodywork that make the impossible drive nearly impossible. And the film takes care to establish these modifications earlier, so that the climactic sequence feels like a payoff rather than a deus ex machina. The political economy of disaster response receives subtle critique through the film's depiction of overwhelmed public infrastructure, the storm shelters that fill too quickly, the emergency services that cannot reach everyone, the gap between official preparedness and actual need that leaves communities dependent on the ad hoc interventions of people like Tyler's crew. The film's relationship to the sublime, the aesthetic category that describes experiences of overwhelming magnitude that transcend ordinary perception, is central to its visual project, the tornadoes photographed not just as threats but as phenomena of terrible beauty, their sculptural forms against the Oklahoma sky evoking the romantic tradition of landscape painting that sought to capture nature's overwhelming scale. The scene in which Kate finally reads the article that Ben has written, discovering that he focused on her work rather than Tyler's celebrity, is played without dialogue, Daisy Edgar Jones conveying through facial expression alone the complex mixture of surprise, validation, and quiet pride that comes from being truly seen by an outside observer. And this wordless moment is among the film's most emotionally resonant. The film's editing rhythm during the calmer middle sections allows for extended takes that let the actors inhabit their space, conversations unfolding in real time rather than being chopped into the rapid-fire shot-reverse-shot patterns that dominate contemporary blockbuster editing. And this directorial patience creates an intimacy that pays dividends when the action accelerates. The product placement that inevitably accompanies a major studio release is integrated with varying degrees of success, the vehicles and technology brands making contextual sense within the world of storm chasing. though occasional shots linger on logos with a conspicuousness that briefly breaks the immersive spell. The film's treatment of risk assessment as a continuous, dynamic process rather than a binary choice between safety and danger reflects the reality of storm chasing as a pursuit where absolute security is impossible, but informed decision-making can reduce exposure to acceptable levels. And Kate's arc involves learning to recalibrate her risk calculations to include the moral hazard of inaction. The generational tension between the older storm chasers who appear briefly and the younger, social media-savvy cohort represented by Tyler's crew suggests a changing of the guard that the film treats with gentle humor rather than conflict. The old guard's skepticism about new methods coexisting with respect for the passion that drives the pursuit regardless of its technological expression. The film's representation of data visualization, the radar screens, the 3D tornado models, the trajectory projections, creates a visual language for scientific thinking that translates abstract meteorological concepts into comprehensible imagery, educating the audience without pausing the narrative for overt explanation. And this integration of information design into cinematic storytelling is among the film's more subtle achievements. The color grading of the New York sequences versus the Oklahoma sequences creates a chromatic distinction that reinforces Kate's psychological journey. The cool blues and grays of her NOAA office giving way to the warm golds and greens of the plains, her emotional thawing mirrored by the increasing saturation of the image itself. The film's treatment of debris as a narrative element, the specific objects that fly past the characters, the photographs and toys and furniture that represent destroyed homes, maintains a connection between the spectacle of destruction and the human reality it represents, preventing the tornado sequences from becoming abstract exercises in visual effects. The cameo appearances and Easter eggs that connect the film to the 1996 original are deployed with restraint, rewarding attentive viewers without punishing those who come to the material fresh, and the film never depends on nostalgia to generate its emotional effects, building its own foundations rather than borrowing from its predecessor. The storm chaser community that served as consultants and extras for the production brings a layer of authenticity that scripted fiction alone could not achieve, their real vehicles and equipment appearing in background shots, their actual chasing strategies informing the characters' decision-making, their lived experience of pursuing tornadoes lending credibility to the dramatized version. The storm chaser community that served as consultants and extras for the production brings a layer of authenticity that scripted fiction alone could not achieve, their real vehicles and equipment appearing in background shots, their actual chasing strategies informing the characters' decision-making, their lived experience of pursuing tornadoes lending credibility to the dramatized version. The film's meditation on the limits of prediction, the tornadoes that intensify unexpectedly, change direction without warning, or develop with terrifying speed, acknowledges the fundamental uncertainty that keeps storm chasing a pursuit of imperfect knowledge, the gap between what can be forecast and what actually occurs remaining the space where both science and danger live. The relationship between Kate and her mother, sketched in only a few scenes, nevertheless provides the emotional foundation for Kate's recovery, the unconditional acceptance of the parental home offering a safety that allows her to risk vulnerability, and the film understands that adult courage often depends on the secure base that childhood, at its best, provides. The film's final argument, embedded in its closing images of collaborative work and shared purpose, is that the appropriate response to overwhelming forces, whether meteorological, psychological, or economic, is not solitary heroism but mutual aid, the recognition that we survive together or not at all, a message delivered without sermonizing through the simple evidence of the characters' choices. The legacy of the 1996 film hangs over this production as both inspiration and burden, the affection that audiences hold for the original creating expectations that no sequel could fully satisfy, and the film navigates this impossible inheritance by honoring its predecessor's spirit while gently suggesting that the world has changed in ways that require new approaches to both storm chasing and storytelling. The temporal structure of the film employs a 5-year ellipsis that accomplishes multiple narrative objectives simultaneously, allowing the rawness of the opening tragedy to settle into the deeper, more complex ache of prolonged grief, while also creating space for the technological and cultural landscape of storm chasing to have transformed in ways that feel organic rather than abrupt. The elapsed time making plausible both Kate's psychological entrenchment in avoidance and the rise of the content creator ecosystem that Tyler represents and navigates. The film's engagement with the ethics of representation, who gets to tell the story of a disaster, and for whose benefit, manifests most pointedly in the contrast between Ben's journalistic project and Tyler's self-documentation, one seeking external truth through observation, the other performing an identity for consumption. Yet the film complicates any simple preference by demonstrating that Tyler's performance generates resources that Ben's article, however well written, cannot match. The meteorological phenomenon of the rain-wrapped tornado, which becomes central to the climax, represents one of the most dangerous scenarios in real-world storm chasing because the condensation and precipitation obscure the funnel's exact location, width, and movement, creating a situation where chasers can find themselves inside a tornado's circulation without ever having seen it approach. And the film exploits this invisibility to generate a particular species of dread distinct from the spectacle of visible funnels. The decision to have the climactic tornado strike an oil refinery introduces industrial infrastructure as a variable in natural disaster. The combination of petrochemicals and extreme winds generating the fire tornado that represents a hybrid catastrophe, neither purely natural nor purely technological. And this hybridity resonates with contemporary anxiety about the compounding of environmental and industrial risks in an era of climate uncertainty. The film's texture of regional authenticity extends to its treatment of Oklahoma's indigenous presence, acknowledged in passing through locations and background details rather than foreground as narrative element, a choice that reflects the reality of the state's demography while also representing a missed opportunity for deeper engagement with communities whose relationship to land and weather carries historical dimensions beyond the film's scope. The architecture of the Stormpar corporate operation, the sleek mobile command center, the branded vehicles, the hierarchical team structure, contrasts visually with the improvisational aesthetic of Tyler's crew, and this contrast spatializes the film's thematic tension between institutional science and grassroots knowledge, between the resources that corporations can mobilize and the agility that independence enables. Kate's physical transformation across the film's runtime, from the guarded, hunched posture of her New York scenes to the open, athletic movement of her Oklahoma return, is a performance choice by Daisy Edgar Jones that communicates character development through embodiment rather than dialogue, the actor using her body as a register of psychological state with a subtlety that rewards attentive viewing. The film's treatment of failure as a necessary component of scientific progress distinguishes it from disaster narratives that present expertise as infallible. The failed first attempt at tornado dissipation serving not to humiliate Kate, but to demonstrate that meaningful problems resist simple solutions, that the gap between theory and application is where actual learning occurs, and that perseverance through failure is the defining characteristic of genuine research. The drone photography that captures the tornadoes from angles impossible for ground-based cameras creates a visual perspective that is simultaneously spectacular and strangely intimate, the aerial viewpoint rendering the storms as sculptural objects rotating against the plains while also revealing the terrifying speed at which they move across the landscape toward populated areas. The film's sound design during quieter moments employs the ambient audio of the Oklahoma environment. Whine through grass, distant thunder, the calls of birds before a storm, to establish an acoustic baseline against which the violence of the tornadoes registers as disruption, the sudden silence that often precedes a strike becoming as frightening as the roar that follows. The relationship between Tyler and his crew operates on principles of mutual respect rather than hierarchy, decisions made collectively, expertise distributed across members, leadership shifting depending on the demands of the moment, and this organizational model represents an alternative to both the corporate structure of Stormpar and the solitary genius model that Kate initially embodies. The film's treatment of the natural world beyond the tornadoes, the weather systems that produce them, the atmospheric conditions that signal their development, the ecological context of the plains, demonstrates an environmental awareness that grounds the spectacle in scientific literacy, the characters reading the sky with a fluency that the film gradually teaches its audience to share. The role of luck in survival receives acknowledgement throughout the narrative. The arbitrary path of a tornado through a town determining who lives and who dies with a randomness that no amount of preparation can eliminate, and this acknowledgement prevents the film's triumphant ending from suggesting that the characters' survival was entirely the product of their own choices or capabilities. The film's depiction of the moments after a tornado strike, when survivors emerge into transformed landscapes where familiar landmarks have vanished, captures the disorientation of disaster that is often elided by narratives that cut directly from impact to resolution. The characters wandering through debris fields trying to reconstruct mental maps of places that no longer exist as they were. The economic precarity of the communities through which the tornadoes travel is established through environmental storytelling. The aging infrastructure, the mobile homes, the small businesses operating on thin margins, creating a visual context that explains both the devastation that the storms cause and the predatory opportunity that disaster capitalists like Riggs exploit. The film's refusal to show Riggs receiving any narrative punishment. He simply exists, his operations presumably continuing after the credits roll, is a realistic choice that acknowledges the limits of individual action against systemic exploitation. The tornado dissipated, but the conditions that allow disaster profiteering unchanged by anything that happens in the film. The generational transmission of scientific passion, from Kate's childhood notebooks to her adult research to the younger women on Tyler's crew who look to her as a model, suggests a lineage of curiosity that the film values as highly as any particular discovery, the perpetuation of the questioning impulse being perhaps more important than any single answer. The film's meditation on home as both place and concept runs through Kate's relationship to Oklahoma, her departure representing not just geographical relocation, but a severing of identity, and her return becomes a homecoming in the deepest sense, a reintegration of self with the landscape and community that formed her, however complicated that formation proved to be. The final sequence at the airport, with its sterile architecture and anonymous crowds, represents the lure of a life without risk or particularity, the generic existence that Kate could choose. And her decision to leave with Tyler is not a rejection of safety per se, but a recognition that the safety she had constructed was indistinguishable from absence, a life where nothing could hurt her because nothing could reach her. The film's cumulative argument, distributed across its runtime through character choices rather than explicit statement, is that the appropriate relationship to danger is neither reckless embrace nor fearful avoidance, but informed engagement, a stance that acknowledges both human vulnerability and human capability. And this argument has applications far beyond the specific context of tornado chasing to encompass any domain where risk and purpose are inextricably linked. The psychological architecture of Kate's trauma exhibits what clinicians describe as a fragmented narrative memory, where the sensory components of the fatal YF-5 encounter, the specific pitch of the wind, the texture of flying debris, the sudden absence where her boyfriend had stood, remain vividly encoded while the temporal sequence has been disrupted, making her freeze response not a rational choice but a somatic intrusion that bypasses conscious deliberation entirely. The film's opening sequence employs a graduated color palette that shifts almost imperceptibly from the warm golds of a promising afternoon to an unsettling greenish yellow that meteorologists recognize as a hallmark of tornado-producing supercells. The sky itself becoming a character whose changing complexion signals approaching catastrophe before any character speaks a word of warning. Javi's professional trajectory from idealistic graduate student to compromised corporate operative represents a cautionary narrative about the seduction of resources, the phased array radar requiring funding that academic grants could never provide, and his gradual moral drift occurring not through dramatic corruption, but through a series of small accommodations that each seemed reasonable in isolation until their cumulative weight became unbearable. The film's treatment of the Oklahoma landscape during the quieter middle sections functions as a form of geographic characterization. The red dirt roads, the wind-sculpted trees, the grain elevators that punctuate the horizon, all establishing a specific sense of place that resists the generic Midwestern backdrop that lesser productions would have accepted. The location shooting paying dividends in atmospheric authenticity. The extended sequence at Kate's mother's farm introduces a domestic temporality that contrasts with the frantic pacing of the chase, Kathy Carter's unhurried movements and sparse dialogue creating a rhythm of rural life that has persisted through generations of storms. And this interlude provides the narrative space for Kate's psychological defenses to begin their slow dissolution. The notebooks that Tyler discovers in Kate's childhood bedroom are not merely plot devices, but material artifacts of a scientific imagination in formation. The handwriting evolving from childish wonder to adolescent precision, the diagrams growing more sophisticated, the marginalia revealing a mind that questioned and revised and dreamed. And Tyler's reverent handling of these documents communicates his respect for her intellect more effectively than any declarative dialogue could. The film's engagement with the aesthetics of destruction maintains a careful balance between spectacle and sobriety, the debris clouds and structural collapses rendered with technical virtuosity, while the camera periodically lingers on specific destroyed objects. A child's bicycle, a wedding photograph, a shattered dinner table, that restore human scale to the devastation. The incorporation of real storm chaser terminology like gorilla hail for exceptionally large hailstones and wedge tornado for funnels wider than they are tall demonstrates the screenwriter's consultation with practitioners, and these terms are deployed in contexts that make their meanings clear without pausing for definition, trusting the audience's inferential capacity. The film's representation of the storm-chasing community as internally diverse, encompassing academic researchers, independent enthusiasts, commercial operators, and content creators, avoids the monolithic portrayal that would simplify the ethical tensions the narrative explores, each subgroup operating according to different incentives and constraints. The climactic fire tornado introduces a color temperature radically different from anything preceding it, the cool blues and grays of rain-wrapped storms giving way to searing oranges and reds that transform the screen into something approaching infernal. And this chromatic shift signals an escalation beyond meteorological disaster towards something that feels almost mythic in its destructive intensity. The decision to have Kate drive into the tornado rather than away from it inverts the survival instinct that has governed her behavior for 5 years, the geometry of her trajectory mapping onto her psychological arc. And the film stages this reversal not as triumphant catharsis, but as terrified necessity, her hands shaking on the steering wheel even as her course remains steady. The physics of the dissipation sequence, while dramatized for cinematic effect, gestures toward real principles of atmospheric intervention. The introduction of massive quantities of moisture-absorbing material combined with ice-nucleating agents, theoretically capable of disrupting the thermodynamic processes that sustain tornadic rotation, though the scales involved remain far beyond current technological capability. The theater shelter sequence pays explicit homage to the original film's drive-in climax, while updating the cultural reference point, the 1996 film's outdoor cinema giving way to an indoor multiplex, and this shift from open sky to enclosed space intensifies the claustrophobia. The survivors trapped not just by the tornado, but by architecture that was never designed to withstand the forces now assailing it. Tyler's injury beneath the streetcar introduces a vulnerability that his characterization has previously only gestured toward. The man who performs fearlessness suddenly dependent on others for his survival, and the film uses this reversal to complete his transformation from archetype to human being. The performative bravado stripped away to reveal the genuine courage that it was always protecting. The film's treatment of Javi's redemption avoids the easy beat of self-sacrifice that lesser screenplays would have deployed, instead giving him the quieter arc of quitting his job, showing up to help, and being integrated into the new collaborative enterprise, his moral rehabilitation achieved through sustained action rather than a single dramatic gesture. The epilogue's depiction of the new storm-chasing business suggests an organizational model that synthesizes the strengths of the various approaches the film has explored: scientific rigor paired with community engagement, technological sophistication paired with ethical accountability, individual expertise paired with collective decision-making. The film's relationship to its predecessor can be understood through the lens of what literary theorists call anxious influence. The sequel simultaneously honoring the original's template and gently revising its assumptions, keeping the structural bones while updating the flesh to reflect changed sensibilities about gender, trauma, and the relationship between humanity and nature. The casting of Anthony Ramos, a performer of Puerto Rican heritage, as Javi introduces demographic diversity to the storm-chasing milieu without making that diversity the subject of narrative attention, his ethnicity neither ignored nor problematized, simply present as part of the fabric of contemporary Oklahoma. The film's visual effects team faced the particular challenge of rendering tornadoes that would satisfy audiences accustomed to the original's practical effects while taking advantage of digital capabilities that were unavailable in 1996, and their solution, grounding the CGI in extensive reference footage of actual tornadoes, produces results that feel observed rather than invented. The score's integration of acoustic instruments associated with Oklahoma's musical traditions, fiddle, steel guitar, harmonica, into the orchestral fabric creates a sonic identity that is regionally specific rather than generically epic, the music rooted in the cultural landscape even as it soars to match the visual scale of the storms. The film's treatment of professional rivalry avoids the zero-sum competitiveness that characterizes many action narratives. Kate and Tyler's initial antagonism giving way to mutual respect, without either having to lose for the other to win. A collaborative rather than competitive model of professional relationship. The atmospheric pressure changes that precede tornadoes, often described by survivors as a feeling of the ears popping or a sense of oppressive weight in the air, are suggested through sound design rather than explicitly referenced in dialogue. The audio mix subtly shifting to create subliminal discomfort that primes the audience for approaching danger. The film's brief depictions of the National Weather Service forecast offices, with their banks of monitors and quietly intense meteorologists, pay tribute to the institutional infrastructure that makes storm chasing possible. The watches and warnings that issue from these unglamorous spaces, representing the public safety net that the characters' more dramatic interventions supplement. The role of social media algorithms in shaping Tyler's public persona remains an unspoken subtext, his catchphrases and stunts calibrated for maximum engagement in ways that the film neither condemns nor endorses, simply presenting as the reality of visibility in a digital attention economy where obscurity is its own form of death. The film's final minutes, in which Kate walks away from the airport toward an uncertain future, embrace a narrative openness that resists the closure of romantic resolution. The partnership with Tyler established as professional and personal without being defined. The ambiguity itself a statement about the priority of purpose over conventional happy endings. The film's opening tragedy unfolds with an almost clinical precision that makes its emotional impact all the more devastating. The gradual escalation from scientific excitement to concerned uncertainty to outright terror, compressed into a handful of minutes that feel simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. The editing accelerating as the situation deteriorates until the deaths occur with a suddenness that mirrors the way catastrophe actually happens in the real world, not with dramatic pauses, but with a velocity that forecloses response. The sodium polyacrylate beads that Kate's team attempts to deploy in that fateful opening sequence represent more than a plot device, functioning as a physical manifestation of the human desire to control the uncontrollable. The belief that sufficient ingenuity can counterbalance forces of nature that dwarf individual agency. And the failure of that first attempt becomes the wound around which Kate organizes her subsequent identity as someone who no longer believes in her own capacity to make a difference. The 5-year gap between the tragedy and the main narrative action places Kate in a developmental limbo that Daisy Edgar-Jones communicates through 1,000 small performance choices. The way she holds her shoulders slightly raised as if braced for impact. The micro-expressions that flicker across her face whenever severe weather is mentioned. The practiced neutrality of someone who has become expert at appearing fine while being anything but. Javi's reappearance in Kate's New York life functions as a return of the repressed. The past she has buried walking through her office door wearing a smile and carrying a proposition. And the film understands that the most dangerous temptations are those that speak to our deepest unfulfilled desires. His offer of 1 week in Oklahoma, appealing to the part of Kate that has been slowly suffocating in the climate-controlled safety of her NOAA cubicle. The Stormpar operation that Javi represents embodies the ambiguous promise of technological solutionism. The phased array radar representing a genuine advance in meteorological science, while the corporate structure that funds it introduces imperatives that have nothing to do with saving lives, and the film navigates this ambivalence without resolving it, presenting technology as simultaneously liberating and compromised. The visual contrast between Kate's New York existence and her Oklahoma past is established through production design as much as cinematography, her apartment decorated in generic neutrals that could belong to anyone anywhere. Her childhood bedroom at the farm still bearing the specific marks of her personality, the posters and photographs and weather instruments that testify to a self she has tried to abandon. Tyler Owens enters the narrative as a figure of pure provocation. His introduction timed to maximize the audience's alignment with Kate's contempt. The cowboy hat and the catchphrases and the merchandise booth reading as everything objectionable about the commodification of scientific pursuit. And the film's subsequent revelation that this surface is a strategic performance rather than an authentic identity constitutes its most effective narrative gambit. The crew that surrounds Tyler operates according to a logic of elective kinship, each member having chosen this precarious life for reasons the film gestures toward without over-explaining, and their easy camaraderie suggests a history of shared danger that has forged bonds more durable than those of conventional employment or even family. the chase functioning as both profession and community. The nighttime tornado sequence at the rodeo represents the film's most sustained engagement with the grammar of horror cinema, the darkness transforming the storm from a visible phenomenon into an invisible presence, the sound of its approach becoming the primary vector of terror, and the swimming pool shelter reducing the characters to a state of helpless exposure that no amount of expertise or equipment can mitigate. The aftermath of the nighttime tornado, with the characters emerging into a transformed world of debris and silence, provides the emotional low point from which the narrative's final ascent must begin. The accumulated weight of near-death and moral revelation pressing Kate toward the confrontation with Javi that will shatter their already fragile alliance. Javi's accusation that Kate is responsible for their friend's deaths functions as the narrative's darkest psychological insight. The recognition that those who share our traumas know precisely where to strike to cause maximum damage, and his deployment of this knowledge as a defensive maneuver reveals the guilt he has been carrying beneath his corporate polish. The survivor's burden that he has managed through denial rather than the confrontation that Kate, despite her avoidance, has at least attempted. The farm sequence that follows Kate's retreat to her mother's home provides the narrative with its necessary decompression, the pace slowing to accommodate the tempo of rural life, and the scenes between Kate and her mother are written with an economy that trusts the performers to communicate volumes through presence rather than dialogue, the silences between them carrying decades of shared history. Tyler's discovery of Kate's childhood notebooks is staged not as invasion but as revelation, his genuine fascination with her early scientific thinking cutting through her defenses in ways that his charm alone could not. And the moment establishes the intellectual foundation for their partnership, the recognition that his respect for her mind precedes and exceeds any romantic interest. The failed first attempt at dissipating a tornado with the polymer beads is essential to the film's credibility, demonstrating that the problem the narrative has set itself cannot be solved through simple repetition of the opening's experiment, and Kate's willingness to try again despite this failure, incorporating new data and a new compound, models the resilience that the film values above raw intelligence or physical courage. The silver iodide deployment that ultimately succeeds represents a synthesis of Kate's original insight with the collaborative resources she has learned to accept, the data from Javi's radar and the delivery platform of Tyler's truck combining with her theoretical understanding to create a solution that no single character could have achieved alone. The film's argument for collective effort made tangible in the mechanism of its climax. The El Reno setting carries documentary weight that enriches the fictional climax, the real 2013 tragedy that claimed the lives of experienced storm chasers hovering at the edges of the frame. And while the film never explicitly references this history, the choice of location functions as a quiet acknowledgement of the genuine mortal stakes that underpin its dramatic spectacle, a gesture of respect from fiction toward the reality it represents. The theater shelter climax, with its explicit visual quotation of the original film's drive-in sequence, operates simultaneously as homage and correction, the indoor multiplex providing less protection than the open space of the drive-in might have, and the roof's progressive collapse creating a countdown structure that generates suspense independent of the tornado's external approach, the danger coming from above as well as from outside. Javi's decision to abandon Stormpar and join the rescue effort at El Reno is rendered without a single line of dialogue explaining his reasoning, Anthony Ramos communicating the character's moral awakening through action alone, and this restraint exemplifies the film's broader commitment to showing rather than telling, trusting the audience to infer internal transformation from external behavior. The airport epilogue that closes the film embraces a tonal complexity rare in blockbuster endings, the possibility of Kate returning to her safe New York life remaining genuinely available until the tornado warning announcement intervenes, and her decision to stay is framed not as the obvious right choice, but as a leap whose outcome remains uncertain, the smile on her face communicating hope rather than certainty. The final image of Kate walking away from the terminal with Tyler, her flight abandoned, the storm warning still active, encapsulates the film's argument about the relationship between safety and purpose, suggesting that a life without risk is also a life without meaning, and that the courage to engage with the forces that threaten us, whether meteorological, psychological, or social, is the foundation of any existence worth living.